The word, when it came, was not a shout, but a sound so quiet it seemed to carve a vacuum in the booming silence of the penthouse boardroom. "Sulesh," Elder Kalen said, his voice a low rumble of granite scraping against granite. He turned his back on the gleaming mahogany table, on the billion-dollar contract, on the man who was bleeding money with every tick of the platinum clock on the wall. He walked towards the floor-to-ceiling window, a pane of flawless glass that framed the sprawling metropolis 60 stories below. It was a conqueror's view, but Kalen looked at it with the profound disinterest of a man viewing a map of a land he never wished to visit. Arthur Sterling felt the blood drain from his face, a cold tide receding to some deep, panicked reservoir in his gut. "What did he say?" he snapped, his voice tight, aimed at the translator. Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose six-figure fee was meant to prevent this very moment, flinched. It's not a direct translation, Mr. Sterling. It's an archaic form, a sentiment. The sentiment, Alistair, now!" Sterling's fist clenched on the table, the knuckles white. "The sentiment is the roots are poisoned." Kalen spoke again, his back still to them, his words a soft, sorrowful cascade in his native Surayan. "He says," Finch stammered, his academic poise shattering, "he says we have offered him a gilded cage and asked him to forget the sky." A guttural curse escaped Sterling's lips. The deal was dead. 2 years of his life, a king's ransom in preliminary investments, all of it evaporating in a puff of incomprehensible poetry. It was in that moment of absolute ringing failure, as the elder's entourage began to gather their things with funereal quiet, that a third voice entered the void. It was impossibly small, a sound like a silver bell, and it spoke a single word in that same lost tongue. Asa. Stay. The word hung in the air, fragile yet unbreakable. Every head turned. Sterling's gaze, burning with fury, followed the others to a small shadow near the service entrance. There, holding a dust rag in one hand and her mother's pant leg in the other, stood a little girl, no older than 8, with eyes as wide and dark as a forest pool. She was looking at Elder Kalen, who had frozen, his hand on the glass, his ancient posture suddenly rigid with shock. He turned slowly, not to the titan of industry or the baffled scholar, but to the cleaner's daughter. And for the first time that day, a flicker of something other than weary disappointment crossed his face. It was wonder. Arthur Sterling's world was one of predictable inputs and desirable outputs. You applied pressure, you got results. You leveraged capital, you created empires. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and aggression, struggled to process the scene before him. The girl, the cleaner's girl. He'd barely registered her presence, another piece of the building's invisible machinery, like the hushed ventilation or the automated blinds. Her name was... he didn't know. Her mother's name was Elena, a vaguely Eastern European woman who polished the marble floors in the lobby and, apparently, the mahogany in his boardroom, with a practiced, self-effacing efficiency. He saw her now, her face a mask of pure terror, one hand clamped on her daughter's shoulder, trying to physically push her back into the shadows from which she had emerged. The girl, however, seemed anchored to the spot, her gaze locked with the elder's. Kalen took a step forward, his heavy embroidered robes whispering against the plush carpet. He ignored Sterling completely. He ignored Finch. The world had contracted to the space between an old man from a forgotten mountain and a child from the city's anonymous workforce. He spoke to her, his voice softer now, the granite edges smoothed away to reveal something ancient and melodic. It was a question. Sterling could tell that much from the inflection. The girl, Alara, he could just make out her mother mouthing the name in a horrified whisper. Alara responded. It was another single word, then a short, shy phrase. A dialogue had begun, a fragile thread spun between them in a language that had just been declared functionally extinct in this room. "What is happening?" Sterling bit out, his voice a low growl. He felt a profound loss of control, a sensation he despised more than anything. This was his room, his deal, his universe, and it was being hijacked by a janitor's kid. Finch, sweating freely now, adjusted his glasses. I don't know, Mr. Sterling. She's speaking the deep dialect, the heart tongue. It's a miracle. It's not taught. It's absorbed. I've only ever read about it in anthropological texts from the early 20th century. It was believed to be lost to all but a handful of the most isolated elders. Elena, the mother, finally found her voice, a choked, desperate sound. "I am so sorry, sir. Alara, stop. Please, we will go." She tugged at her daughter's arm, but the girl didn't budge. She was in a world of her own, a world shared only by the old man, who was now slowly sinking to one knee, bringing his eyes level with hers. The disparity was staggering. Kalen, a man who commanded the resources of a nation, a man whose signature Sterling needed more than his next breath, was kneeling on a $50,000 rug before a child who probably ate her dinner in a cramped two-room apartment miles from this gilded tower. Kalen smiled, a true smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and said something that sounded like a gentle laugh. Alara smiled back, a shy, hesitant curving of her lips. She pointed a small finger towards the window. She told him his home must miss the sight of him, Finch translated, his voice filled with an academic's awe. And he asked her how she knew of his home. She said the sky in his eyes is the same as the one in her grandmother's stories. The grandmother's stories. Sterling's mind latched onto the phrase. It was a data point, a possible access vector. He felt a sliver of his usual control returning. The deal wasn't dead. It was on life support, and the defibrillator was an 8-year-old girl in a worn-out dress. He took a measured step forward, composing his features into a mask of calm authority. He would handle this. He would reassert order. "Elena," he said, his voice softer than he intended, but still carrying the unmistakable ring of command. The woman flinched, as if struck. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. Sir. Bring your daughter here." It wasn't a request. Elena looked from Sterling's cold blue eyes to the Sorayan elder, who was now rising slowly to his feet, his gaze never leaving Alara. He saw the shift in the room, the corporate predator re-engaging, and a shadow fell over his face. He said something to Alara, a final, soft word, and then straightened, his regal bearing returning like a cloak. He turned to face Sterling. His entourage, which had paused in the doorway, watched with unreadable expressions. "The elder," Finch translated, his voice regaining a semblance of professional rhythm. "The elder Kalen says that the spirits of his ancestors have sent him a sign, a voice of innocence, to speak truth in a room of hollow men." Sterling felt a flash of anger at the insult, but he suppressed it. He needed this. "Tell him," Sterling said, his eyes fixed on Kalen, "that I am not a hollow man. Tell him I am a man who honors truth, and that this child This sign is a reason for us to continue our discussion. Finch translated. Kalen listened, his head tilted slightly. His dark eyes moved from Sterling to Alara, then back again. He spoke a single clipped sentence in return. He agrees to one more meeting, Finch said, a note of disbelief in his voice. But not here. Sterling's eyebrows shot up. Not here? Where? Kalen's gaze drifted to the window, to the distant smudge of green that was Central Park. He spoke again, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Finch translated, He will meet you tomorrow at dawn by the oldest oak tree you can find. And Finch paused, looking at the small girl who was now clinging tightly to her mother's side. He says she must be there. The hours that followed were a masterclass in controlled chaos, orchestrated by Arthur Sterling. The Surayan delegation was placated, escorted to their fleet of black cars with strained but polite assurances. Dr. Finch was debriefed, every scrap of his knowledge on the heart tongue extracted and analyzed. And Elena and Alara were moved from the service corridors to a guest suite on the 48th floor, a place of beige luxury and disorienting silence. Elena sat on the edge of an impossibly soft sofa, her hands clenched in her lap, her cleaner's uniform looking starkly out of place against the silk cushions. Alara, meanwhile, had her nose pressed against the window, her small fingerprints marring the perfect glass as she stared down at the river of lights that was the city at night. She had never been this high before. For her, the world had always been a place of pavement, of looking up at the canyons of steel and glass from the bottom. Now she was in the sky. "Did I do a bad thing, Mama?" she asked, her voice a small whisper that was almost lost in the room's climate-controlled hum. Elena was by her side in an instant, wrapping her arms around her daughter's small frame. "No, Mija, no. You did nothing bad. You were you." But her voice trembled. She was terrified. In her world, you survived by being invisible. You cleaned the messes of the powerful. You never made them. Her daughter had just spoken to a man worth more than the entire city block they lived on, and in doing so, had made herself the most visible person in Arthur Sterling's world. That was a dangerous place to be. Sterling entered the suite without knocking. He had replaced his suit jacket with a cashmere sweater, a calculated attempt at casualness that fooled no one, least of all Elena. He moved like a shark, even in soft wool. He ignored the sitting area and walked to the bar, pouring himself a glass of water. "She needs to be ready by 5 a.m., he said, not looking at them. "A car will be waiting downstairs. She should wear something warm." Elena clutched Alara tighter. "Mr. Sterling, sir. She is just a child. She does not understand these things. This business. I don't want her involved." Sterling finally turned to look at them. His eyes were devoid of sympathy. They were instruments of assessment. "Elena, your daughter is already involved. She's the only thing holding a $2 billion resource deal together. So, for now, what you want is irrelevant." He softened his tone, the way one might gentle a spooked horse before putting the bit in its mouth. "Listen, no harm will come to her. I give you my word. All she has to do is what she did today. Talk, translate. I'll handle the rest." He looked at Alara, who peeked out from behind her mother's arm. "You have a gift, kid," he said, a statement of fact, not a compliment. "Your grandmother, she was Surayan." Elena nodded jerkily. "My mother. She came here after the Great Fire. She never spoke of it much. She taught Alara, the old songs, the old stories. She said it was the language of the soul, for remembering who we are. Right, Sterling said, the sentimentality lost on him. The language of the soul. Can she use it to ask the elder why the roots are poisoned? Elena shook her head. It is not a language for contracts. It is a language for feelings, for the earth. A tree is not just wood. The river is not just water. Everything has a spirit, a story. My mother used to say, you cannot own the land any more than you can own your own blood. Sterling felt a familiar throb of frustration in his temples. This was the problem. He was trying to conduct business, and they were talking him riddles. He was offering wealth, infrastructure, jobs, a modern future. They were talking about spirits and stories. It was like trying to merge two fundamentally incompatible operating systems. He finished his water and set the glass down with a decisive click. 5 a.m., he repeated. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the handle. I'm prepared to be very generous, Elena. A new apartment, a school for Alara, the best in the city, a fund for her future. All you have to do is help me. The offer hung in the air, a glittering lure. It was everything Elena had ever dreamed of for her daughter. A way out of the endless cycle of scrubbing floors and living in fear of the next rent increase. But the price was Ilara's gift. Her grandmother's legacy, to be used as a key to unlock a vault for a man like Sterling. She looked down at her daughter's dark hair, smelled the familiar scent of cheap shampoo in childhood, and felt a profound aching conflict. Sterling didn't wait for an answer. He already knew he had won. He always won. He left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving them alone in the gilded cage. Dawn in Central Park was a watercolor painting of grays and blues, the air crisp and smelling of damp earth. A black SUV, silent as a phantom, idled by the curb. Arthur Sterling stood beside it, wearing a tailored overcoat, his breath pluming in the cold. He looked impatient. A few feet away, Elena was fussing with Alara's coat, pulling a knitted hat down over her ears. Alara looked small and lost in the vastness of the park, her eyes wide as she took in the gnarled, ancient silhouettes of the trees against the lightening sky. The deal felt absurd here. In the boardroom, it was numbers on a page, resource yields, profit margins. Here, it was mist and birdsong, and the quiet dignity of a sleeping forest. Elder Kalen was already there, standing beneath the sprawling branches of a great oak, its limbs like the arms of a slumbering giant. He was not alone. Two of his aides stood at a respectful distance. He wasn't wearing his formal robes, but a simple, heavy wool cloak that made him look less like a foreign dignitary and more like a shepherd. As they approached, Sterling put a hand on Alara's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt proprietary. Okay, kid, just like we talked about. Be my ears and my mouth. Alara shrank away from his touch, moving closer to her mother. Kalen watched them approach, his expression unreadable. He greeted Ilara first, a soft murmur in Sarayan. Ilara replied, her voice barely a whisper. What did he say? Sterling demanded. Alara looked at her mother, who gave her a slight trembling nod of encouragement. He said, Good morning, little bird. Did you dream well in the iron nest? Iron nest. Sterling's penthouse. Of course. Tell him I dreamed of progress, of a partnership that will benefit both our peoples. Alara dutifully translated, her small voice reciting the corporate platitude. Kalen listened, then responded, his eyes on Sterling. He says, Ilara translated back, her brow furrowed in concentration. He says a partnership is when two people walk the same path. You wish for him to walk your path, but you have not asked where his path leads. Sterling fought to keep his composure. It was another riddle, a waste of time. My path leads to prosperity, to the future. Ask him what's wrong with that. The words were translated. Kalen's reply was longer this time. He gestured to the ancient oak tree above them. He says, this tree has a future. It will grow new leaves in the spring. It will give shade in the summer. It will sleep in the winter. Its future is bound to the seasons, to the sun, to the earth. It does not dream of becoming a ship. It dreams of being a tree. He then looked directly at Sterling. He asks, what is the future of the forest when you have turned all the trees into ships? The accusation was plain. Sterling felt the sting of it. His plan involved extensive logging in the northern territories of Soraya, clearing land for the cobalt refineries. It was a standard part of the resource extraction process. It was progress. The ships carry goods, Sterling said, his voice hard. They bring medicine. They build schools. You can't build a school out of sentiment. He was losing his patience. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a philosophy seminar. Kalen seemed to understand his tone, if not his words. He spoke to Ilara again, his voice gentle. Ilara listened, then turned to Sterling, her small face serious. He wants to know about the poison. The poison? Sterling was confused. The roots. The roots are poisoned. What does that mean? Kalen pointed down at the ground, at the intricate network of roots that broke the surface of the soil around the base of the oak. He spoke at length, his voice a low, rhythmic cadence, like a story being told around a fire. Ilara listened intently, her eyes wide. It took her a moment to piece it all together, to find the English words for concepts that didn't neatly fit. The contract, she began, her voice hesitant. The words you use. You have a section, a clause, about the land. It says you will have undisputed title and mineral rights in perpetuity. Sterling nodded. Standard language. It means we own the land and everything underneath it. Forever. He watched as Ilara translated this concept. A storm cloud passed over Kalen's face. His response was sharp, angry. He says, Ilara took a small, shaky breath. He says you cannot say that in his language. There is no word for it. The idea. It is the poison. To own the land forever? He says it is like trying to own the rain, or your great-grandfather's spirit. He says the land does not belong to us. We belong to the land, for a little while, and then we return to it. To say you own it is a sickness, a lie. It poisons the roots of truth. Sterling stared at him. For the first time, he began to understand. The problem wasn't the price. It wasn't the percentages. It was the very foundation of Western law and commerce. It was the concept of ownership itself. His entire world, his entire identity, was built on that concept. He owned buildings, companies, stocks, ideas. To him, it was as natural as breathing. To Kalen, it was a disease. The chasm between them seemed impossibly vast. He had no idea how to bridge it. But then he looked down at Ilara. The little girl was standing between them, her small hands twisting the hem of her coat. She wasn't just translating words. She was holding two incompatible worlds in her small hands, trying to keep them from flying apart. She was the only bridge he had. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He had to try. He had to walk onto her bridge. Ask him, Sterling said, his voice quieter, stripped of its usual arrogance. Ask him. How does one become a steward? How do you ask the land for permission? The question hung in the misty air. It was a concession, a crack in the armor of Sterling's certainty, and Kalen seemed to recognize it as such. He studied Sterling's face for a long moment, as if searching for the sincerity behind the words. Then he spoke to Alara, not with the sharp edge of debate, but with the cadence of a teacher. Alara translated, "He says you do not ask with words written on dead trees," a pointed reference to the contract paper. "You ask with your feet. You walk the land. You ask with your hands. You touch the bark of the trees and feel the coolness of the river stones. You ask with your ears. You listen to the wind in the high grass and the cry of the hawk. You must learn its language first." "And what if I do all that?" Sterling pressed. "What then?" "Then," Alara said, her eyes fixed on Kalen's, channeling his gravity, "the land will tell you if your spirit is welcome." This was madness. He was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He had board meetings, shareholder reports, quarterly earnings calls. He didn't have time to go on a spiritual walkabout to commune with a forest. Yet the $2 billion deal depended on it. His legacy depended on it. He looked at Kalen, then at the child translator. There was no other way. "Fine," Sterling said through gritted teeth. "I'll listen. Where do we start?" Kalen's reply was simple. He pointed not to some distant, imagined forest in his homeland, but to the park around them. For the next 2 hours, an extraordinary procession took place. An old Sorayan elder, a ruthless American capitalist, a terrified cleaning woman, and her 8-year-old daughter walked through Central Park. Kalen led them away from the paved paths onto the damp earth. He would stop periodically, pointing out things Sterling had never noticed in his life. He pointed to a patch of moss growing on the north side of a rock, explaining how it was a natural compass, a sign of the earth telling you its secrets if you knew how to look. Through Alara, he told a story about the moss, how it was the world's first blanket, a gift from the Creator to keep the sleeping stones warm. He crumbled a bit of soil in his fingers, lifting it to his nose. He spoke of its scent, not as dirt, but as the breath of everything that had ever lived and died on that spot, a library of memories. Sterling, to his credit, listened. He was a man who respected data, and Kalen was providing it, just not in the form of spreadsheets. He was learning a new form of due diligence. He found himself looking, truly looking, at the texture of bark, at the way the light filtered through the leaves, at the intricate patterns of a spider's web. He felt foolish. He felt out of his depth. But he also felt a flicker of something else, something he hadn't felt since he was a boy, building dams in a creek behind his childhood home, a sense of wonder. Alara was the conduit. She didn't just translate, she interpreted. When Kalen used a Sorayan word that meant both leaf and breath, she explained it. He says the trees breathe for the world, so each leaf is a little breath. When he described the roots of the tree, he used a phrase she translated as the fingers that hold the mother's hand. She was painting a picture of a world where everything was alive, interconnected, and sacred. At one point, Kalen stopped by the lake. He pointed to the reflection of the skyscrapers on the water's surface. "He asks," Alara said, "if the man in the water is the same as the man on the shore. He says your contract is like the man in the water. It looks like the real thing, but it has no heart. If you throw a stone, it breaks. The real world is not so easily broken. They were words Sterling would have dismissed as hippie nonsense a day ago. But coming through the child's voice, filtered through the sincerity of the old man, they landed differently. He was seeing his own world through their eyes, and it looked thin, brittle, an illusion of strength like the reflection on the water. Finally, they returned to the great oak. Kalen placed a hand on its trunk. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He spoke a final lengthy piece to Alara. She listened, her small face a mask of concentration. "He says," she began, choosing her words carefully, "that you have listened today. It is a start. He will not sign your paper. The paper is dead." Sterling's heart sank. It was over. He had failed. "But," Alara continued, holding up a small finger, "he will make a pact with you, not on paper, on this tree. He says this tree has seen more sunrises than all the men in your city combined. Its word is stronger than any court." "A pact?" Sterling asked, bewildered. "What kind of pact?" "He will allow you to come to his land, not as a buyer, as a guest. You will walk the sacred groves with him. You will listen to their stories. And if, and at the end of that journey, the land accepts you, he will show you where the blue stone sleeps." Blue stone. That's what they called cobalt. "And our agreement? The terms? The investment?" "He says the terms will be written on the heart, not on paper. The land will provide the stone. You will provide the schools and the medicine. But you will not be an owner. You will be a guardian, a partner to the forest, not its master. That is the only deal he will make." It was unprecedented, unenforceable, a deal based on trust and a spiritual journey. His lawyers would have him committed. His board would revolt. It was the single most insane business proposition he had ever heard. He looked at the old man's unyielding face. He looked at the ancient, silent oak. He looked down at the 8-year-old girl who had become the fulcrum of his entire future. He thought of the reflection on the water, so easily broken. Maybe his way, the paper way, wasn't the only way. Maybe, just maybe, a promise made to a tree was stronger than one made to a lawyer. "Tell him," Sterling said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. "I accept his pact." Kalen's eyes widened slightly. He nodded, a slow, grave gesture of respect. He then reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He pressed it into Alara's hands. "A gift," Alara whispered, her eyes shining as she looked at the beautiful object. "For the little bird who sings the song of her grandmother." Kalen turned and walked away, his aides falling in step behind him, leaving Sterling, Elena, and Alara standing in the quiet morning light, the impossible pact hanging between them like the mist in the branches of the ancient oak. The journey to Soraya was a jarring transition from one reality to another. They flew for 16 hours on Sterling's private jet, a tube of climate-controlled luxury and whispered service, only to land on a dusty airstrip, carved out of the dense green jungle. The air that hit them when the door opened was thick, humid, and alive with the scent of damp earth, unknown blossoms, and something wild and ancient. There were no black cars waiting. There was only Elder Kalen, standing beside a battered, open-backed truck, looking far more at home here than he ever had in New York. The ride that followed was bone-jarring. They rattled for hours along a dirt track that was more of a suggestion than a road, plunging deeper into a landscape of breathtaking, intimidating beauty. Mountains clawed at the sky, their peaks shrouded in mist. Waterfalls cascaded down sheer rock faces, their roar a constant presence. The sheer, untamed vitality of the place made Sterling's world of glass and steel feel like a sterile museum. Ilara, seated between her mother and Sterling, was not intimidated. She was enchanted. Her eyes drank in the impossible greens of the jungle, the flashes of color from parrots that screeched overhead. It was as if her grandmother's stories were coming to life around her. "It's real, Mama," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "It's all real." Their destination was not a town or a city, but a small village of wooden houses built on stilts at the edge of a crystal-clear river. The people who came out to greet them moved with a quiet grace, their faces curious but welcoming. They were Kalen's people. Their deference to him was absolute, but it was the deference of love and respect, not fear. Sterling, the billionaire titan, was an anomaly here. His expensive hiking gear, his satellite phone, his very posture of command meant nothing. He was a guest, an outsider, and for the first time in his adult life, he was utterly without power. He was dependent on Kalen's goodwill and on Ilara's translations. The pact began not with a meeting, but with a meal. They sat on woven mats in Kalen's home, a simple but beautiful structure open to the jungle air, and ate a stew of fish and strange, flavorful roots from a communal bowl. Kalen told stories, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the narrative, and Ilara translated. He told of the river, how it was the lifeblood of the forest, and how its spirit grew angry when men took more fish than they needed. He told of the great ceiba tree at the center of the village, how its roots reached down into the underworld and its branches held up the sky, a ladder for the spirits. Sterling listened, forcing himself to be patient. He kept trying to steer the conversation towards logistics, towards the location of the cobalt deposits, the feasibility of building an access road. But every time he did, Kalen would smile gently and change the subject, bringing it back to a story about a clever monkey or a wise jaguar. It was maddening. He felt like a man trying to read a stock ticker while being forced to listen to a poetry reading. His frustration grew over the next few days. The journey Kalen had promised was literal. Each day, they would walk for hours into the jungle. Kalen, despite his age, moved with a tireless, fluid grace. Sterling, for all his sessions with a personal trainer, found himself gasping for breath in the oppressive humidity, his clothes soaked with sweat. He was being tested, he knew, and he was failing. One afternoon, they reached a clearing dominated by a grove of colossal trees. They were far larger and older than anything he had seen in Central Park, their trunks as wide as small houses, their canopies forming a cathedral-like ceiling high above. The air here was different, cooler still, and filled with a palpable sense of peace. "This is the first of the sacred groves," Ilara translated Kalen's soft words. "The grove of whispers. Our ancestors are buried at the roots of these trees. When the wind blows, they speak to us." Kalen gestured for them to sit. He explained that this was the land Sterling's original plan had designated for clear-cutting. This was the forest that was to become a refinery. He said it with no malice, simply as a statement of fact. Sterling looked at the magnificent trees, at the play of light and shadow on the forest floor. He imagined the sound of chainsaws, the crash of falling giants. A month ago, he would have seen it as the necessary sound of progress. Now, for the first time, It felt like a desecration. He felt Elena stiffen beside him. She was staring at the trunk of one of the trees, her eyes wide. Carved into the bark, weathered by time, were a series of symbols. "The story of the great fire," she whispered in English, her voice trembling. "My mother. She had these symbols on a small piece of wood she always carried. She told me it was the story of why she had to leave." Kalen had noticed her reaction. He spoke to her directly, in Sarayan. It was the first time he had truly addressed her. Elena, hesitant at first, began to speak. Her Sarayan was rusty, halting, the language of her childhood half forgotten. But as she spoke, encouraged by Kalen's patient nods, the words began to flow more easily. She pointed to the carvings, tracing them with her finger. She was telling him who she was, her grandmother's name, her family's story. Alara watched, forgotten for a moment, as her mother and the elders spoke. She was no longer the translator. Her mother was speaking the heart tongue herself, reclaiming a part of her that had been buried for decades under the concrete of a foreign city. Kalen listened, and when she was finished, he placed a hand on her shoulder. He spoke, and even without a translation, Sterling understood the weight of his words. Elena began to weep, quiet, cleansing tears. "He knew her," Elena said, turning to Sterling, her face wet but her eyes shining. "He knew my grandmother. He says she was the daughter of the keeper of this grove. My family, we were guardians." Sterling was floored. The invisible cleaning woman who polished his floors was descended from the hereditary guardians of the very land he was trying to buy. The cosmic irony was not lost on him. It was no longer just a business deal. It had become a story of family, of homecoming, of a circle closing across generations. He looked at Alara, who was now holding her mother's hand, a small solid anchor in a sea of overwhelming emotion. The little girl hadn't just brought him here to close a deal. She had brought her mother home, and in doing so, she was forcing Arthur Sterling to question the very definition of the word. What was home? Was it a penthouse in the sky? Or was it a connection to a piece of land, to the stories carved in the bark of an ancient tree? He didn't have an answer, but for the first time, he felt a genuine desire to find out. The revelation in the Grove of Whispers changed the dynamic completely. Elena was no longer a terrified bystander. She was a participant, a link in a chain of history. Her fluency in the heart tongue returned with surprising speed, as if a long dormant muscle was reawakening. She began to walk alongside Kalen, talking with him about the history of the groves, the meanings of the different plants, the lineage of the families. Sterling and Alara now walked behind them, an odd, silent pair. The translating duties had shifted. Now it was Elena who would occasionally turn and explain a concept to Sterling in English. Alara, her primary role diminished, became an observer. Sterling found himself watching her. In the city, she had been a shy, quiet child. Here, in the forest, she was different. She moved with a new confidence, her senses alive. She would point out a camouflaged lizard or the intricate structure of a flower, her face lit with a pure, uncomplicated joy. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sterling received a call on his satellite phone. It was his COO, Richard, his voice tinny and fraught with the anxieties of the world Sterling had left behind. "Arthur, the board is getting restless. There's been no communication, no signed documents. The investors are spooked. The media is starting to sniff around, asking why the Sarayan deal went dark. We're down 3% since Monday. A week ago, this news would have sent a jolt of panic through Sterling's system. He would have barked orders, demanded action. But now, sitting under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to hurt his eyes, the concerns of Wall Street felt distant, almost absurd. He looked across the fire at Ilara, who was listening to Kalen tell a story, her face rapt. "The deal is proceeding, Richard," Sterling said, his voice calm. "It's just not on our timeline." "What does that mean?" "Arthur, we have a fiduciary duty." "Richard, have you ever considered that a tree might have more wisdom than a team of lawyers?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Arthur, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Sterling said, a small wry smile touching his lips. "I'm learning a new language. I'll be in touch." He ended the call, cutting the frantic energy of his world off at the source. He felt a strange sense of liberation. For his entire life, he had been a slave to timelines, to quarterly reports, to the insatiable beast of shareholder value. Here, time was measured differently, by the slow growth of a tree, the patient erosion of a stone by the river. It was a profound and unsettling shift in perspective. The next day, Kalen led them to the final and most sacred place, the grove of elders, where the blue stone was said to sleep. It was a valley, a hidden amphitheater of stone and foliage, with a massive waterfall at one end that fed a tranquil turquoise pool. The walls of the valley were streaked with thick, unmistakable veins of cobalt ore. It was richer, more accessible than any of his geological surveys had dared to predict. The old Sterling, the predator, would have felt a jolt of avarice, a triumphant surge of acquisition. But the man standing at the edge of the grove felt something different. He saw not just a mineral deposit worth billions, but the heart of a sacred place. He saw the waterfall Kalen called the Tears of the Sky Mother, and the pool he called the place where the moon comes to bathe. He understood, with a clarity that was both devastating and enlightening, that to mine this place with the brutal efficiency he had originally planned would not just be an industrial act, but a spiritual one. It would be like ripping the heart out of a living being. Kalen stood beside him, watching his face. "Now, you see," Elena translated his quiet words, "the blue stone is our sacred trust. It gives the water its color, its life. It is part of her. Her being the land, the sky, the spirit of this place. To take it, you must give something in return, a promise of equal value." "Schools," Sterling said, his voice raspy. "Medicine, clean water infrastructure." Kalen nodded. "These are good things. But they are branches. What of the root? The people who will run these schools, who will administer this medicine. They are losing their way. The young ones are drawn to the cities. They forget the heart tongue. They forget the stories. They learn to want what you have, and they forget the value of what is theirs." He looked at Sterling, his eyes piercing. "Your world is a hungry ghost, Sterling man. It devours cultures and leaves behind shopping malls and empty hearts. If we make this pact, you must promise to help us fight the ghost." It was the core of the deal. Not just an exchange of resources for money, but a pact to help preserve the very culture he had been on the verge of destroying. It was an obligation that went far beyond any contract his lawyers had ever drafted. He would have to invest not just capital, but himself. He would have to become a true guardian. He looked at the cobalt, the source of unimaginable wealth, and he looked at Ilara, who was skipping a stone across the turquoise pool, her laughter echoing in the sacred valley. A little girl who had reminded them all of the language of the soul. He knew what his answer had to be. "The ghost will not have this place," Arthur Sterling said, and it was a promise made not to Kalin, but to the land itself. "I will be a guardian." The pact was sealed not with a signature, but with a ceremony. At the base of the waterfall, in the presence of the village elders, Sterling, Kalin, and Elena placed their hands in the turquoise pool, its water shockingly cold and humming with a strange, deep energy from the cobalt beneath. They pledged their partnership, a promise to take from the land only what was needed, and to replenish it with care, respect, and a commitment to its people. The journey back was the inverse of their arrival. The world of Soraya no longer felt intimidating and alien to Sterling. It felt real. The jungle was no longer a hostile mass of vegetation, but a complex living system he had just begun to understand. The city, when they finally returned, was the thing that felt strange. The noise, the rush, the endless canyons of lifeless concrete and glass seemed jarring and unnatural. The air tasted stale, thin, and empty. In the guest suite of his own tower, the silence felt different. It was no longer a symbol of luxury and power, but a profound and unnerving absence of life. Sterling didn't go back to his penthouse. He stayed in the guest suite, finding his own opulent apartment too vast and too empty. He spent hours on the phone, not with his board, but with engineers, environmental architects, and cultural preservation experts. His conversations were no longer about maximizing yield and minimizing costs. They were about geothermal energy, sustainable forestry, and how to build a school that incorporated traditional Sorayan design. He was a man transformed, possessed by a new and far more complex vision. His COO, Richard, thought he had lost his mind. "A non-binding spiritual pact? Arthur, the shareholders will crucify us." "Let them try," Sterling had replied, his voice calm and certain. "We're not just mining for cobalt anymore, Richard. We're building a future, and it's going to be worth a hell of a lot more than $2 billion. He was true to his word to Elena and Alara. He purchased a bright, spacious apartment for them overlooking the park where the second meeting had taken place. He enrolled Ilara in the city's finest school, but it was more than just a financial transaction. He visited them often, not as a boss or a benefactor, but as a friend. He would bring books for Ilara and sit and talk with Elena for hours about the plans for Soraya. He needed her. She was his cultural compass, his partner in this new venture. He established the Soraya Heritage Foundation, an organization dedicated to preserving the Sorayan language and culture. He appointed Elena as its director. Her first project was to create a digital archive of the stories and songs of the elders, ensuring the heart tongue would never truly be lost. Elena, the woman who had survived by being invisible, had found her voice and her purpose. She was no longer a cleaner. She was a guardian, just like her ancestors. One crisp autumn afternoon, months after their return, Sterling was in the park with Alara. Elena was at a meeting for the foundation. Alara was teaching him the Sorayan names for the different trees, her small voice confident and clear. He was a clumsy student, his tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds, much to her amusement. "No, no," she giggled, correcting his pronunciation for the third time. "You say it like you have a little river flowing in your mouth." He laughed, a genuine, unforced sound that was becoming more common for him. He looked at this remarkable child who had so profoundly and unexpectedly altered the course of his life. "You know," he said, growing serious, "you saved me, Alara." She looked up at him, her dark eyes questioning. From what? He thought for a moment. How could he explain it? The emptiness of his success? The spiritual poverty of his wealth? He gestured vaguely at the city skyline that pierced the sky beyond the park's trees. "From the iron nest," he said, using the phrase Kalen had coined. A look of understanding dawned on her face. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers curling around his. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of connection. In her touch, he felt the echo of everything he had learned. The feel of the ancient bark, the cold of the sacred pool, the unbreakable bond between a people and their home. The billion-dollar deal had failed, but in its place, something far more valuable had been forged. A pact written not on paper, but on the heart. A bridge built not of steel, but of a child's voice, speaking a language of truth. Arthur Sterling looked down at the cleaner's daughter, the little girl who spoke the language of the soul, and for the first time, in a very, very long time, he felt truly rich. He had found his own roots, and they were, at last, beginning to heal. He still had a company to run, a world of demands and expectations. But the hungry ghost no longer had its hold on him. He was a guardian now. He had a promise to keep, to a forest, to a people, and to the little girl who had taught him how to listen to the whispers of the world.